The town of Black Hollow felt like a graveyard. The air was thick, suffocating, as though the forest that surrounded it was pressing in, waiting to consume what little remained. I parked my car in the middle of the cracked asphalt road that cut through the town square, the headlights casting long, jagged shadows across the hollow windows of abandoned buildings. Nothing moved. No birds. No wind. Just the oppressive silence that seemed to stretch endlessly. I stepped out of the car, my boots crunching against the gravel as I scanned the scene. The buildings were relics of another time, weathered storefronts with peeling paint, their signs faded to illegibility. An old gas station stood at the edge of the square, its pumps rusted and covered in vines. A single swing dangled from a crooked frame near what must have been a park, its chains creaking softly, despite the absence of any breeze. The hair on the back of my neck prickled as I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat. The moment I crossed into Black Hollow, it was as if the world had stopped. The stories I'd read, the research I'd pored over for weeks, hadn't prepared me for the reality of this place. This wasn't just abandonment, it was erasure. An entire town, frozen in the moment it had died. I slung the camera strap over my shoulder and forced my legs to move. The first stop was the church, its steeple barely visible above the treetops. The path to it was overgrown. The asphalt buckled and cracked beneath the weight of time. The closer I got, the heavier the air felt, pressing against my chest like an invisible hand. The door to the church hung slightly ajar. The wood warped and splintered. I pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The scent of decay hit me immediately. Mildew, damp wood, and something faintly metallic, like old blood. The interior was cloaked in shadows, the faint light from the outside barely reaching past the threshold. Pews sat in uneven rows, many of them overturned or broken, as if something had swept through the room with violent force. The pulpit at the front was intact, though, and atop it sat a journal. The sight of it made my pulse quicken. It was the first real evidence I'd found, something tangible in a place that felt more like a dream or a nightmare. I approached cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The journal was old, its leather cover cracked, and its pages yellowed. I opened it, my hands trembling slightly, and scanned the first few entries. The handwriting was hurried, uneven, as though the author had written in a state of panic. We tried the ritual again last night. The forest is angry. The echo is restless. It whispers to us, even in our dreams. We can't stop it. We can only delay. My breath caught. The echo, the name I'd seen in passing references, scattered across decades of folklore and hearsay. A presence, a force tied to the forest, worshipped or feared, depending on who you asked. I flipped through the pages, each entry more frantic than the last. The children are gone, taken. We heard them calling from the woods. But when we went to find them, there was nothing there. Just the marks, carved into the trees. The echo demands more. It always demands more. The pages blurred together as I read, my mind racing. The marks. Viol. Edve. Highly signed. I'd seen drawings of them in old photographs. Spirals and symbols carved deep into the trunks of trees. Warnings. Warn. Hives is boundaries. But what did they mean? And what had the town done to appease this thing? A sudden noise snapped me out of my thoughts. A thud, soft but distinct, from somewhere above me. My head jerked up, my heart pounding as I scanned the rafters. The shadows were deep, the angles of the beams creating dark pockets where anything or nothing could be hiding. The sound came again, louder this time, like footsteps on old wood. My throat tightened as I backed away from the pulpit, clutching the journal against my chest. The logical part of my brain screamed that it was just the building settling, the creak of old timber expanding and contracting, but it didn't feel like that. I turned toward the staircase that led to the bell tower. The wooden steps, weathered and uneven, each creak beneath my boots felt deafening. The sound amplified in the oppressive stillness. My flashlight illuminated the narrow passage ahead, the beam cutting through the dust that hung heavy in the air. The whispering began halfway up the stairs. At first it was so faint that I thought it was the wind. A soft rustling noise that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. But as I ascended, it grew louder, the words indistinct but urgent, layered on top of one another like voices from a distant crowd. My chest tightened as I reached the top, the light from my flashlight trembling as I scanned the space. Oh, the bell tower was empty. The massive bell hung motionless in its frame, its surface tarnished with age. The wooden floor beneath it was littered with debris, feathers, twigs, and scraps of paper, as though something had made a nest there. I turned slowly, the whispers still filling the air, though I couldn't pinpoint their source. And then I saw it. On the far wall, scratched into the wood, was a symbol, a spiral surrounded by jagged lines, its edges burned black as though scorched by fire. The whispers stopped the moment my flashlight touched it, the sudden silence more unnerving than the noise had been. I took a step closer, the cold air biting at my skin, and reached out to touch the mark. The instant my fingers brushed the surface, a sound exploded through the church below. A single resonant chime that shook the entire building. I stumbled back, my heart hammering as the vibrations rattled the floor beneath me. The bell above me remained still. It wasn't the church bell. The sound came again, louder this time, reverberating through my chest. The whispers returned, more frenzied now, and the shadows around the edges of the room seemed to shift and ripple. Panic surged through me as I turned and bolted down the stairs, the journal still clutched tightly in my arms. When I burst out of the church, the air felt different, heavier. The forest around me was still, but it wasn't empty. Something was watching. The air outside the church was colder than before, sharper somehow, as if the very atmosphere had shifted. The journal felt heavy in my hands, the leather binding warm against my clammy skin. My pulse thundered in my ears, and my breath came in uneven gasps as I scanned the tree line that encircled Black Hollow like a living wall. The sound had come from somewhere deeper in the town, a low, resonant tone that lingered in the air long after it should have faded. It wasn't the church bell. That was impossible. Whatever it was, it had shaken the walls, reverberating through the hollow like a warning. I tucked the journal into my bag, my fingers trembling as I zipped it shut. Oh, here's the best. The empty streets stretched out before me, silent and watchful. My car was parked just ahead, its familiar outline a small comfort in the sea of unknowns. I moved toward it quickly, my boots crunching on the uneven gravel, the sound too loud in the oppressive quiet. I hadn't taken more than a few steps when I felt it. It wasn't a sound, exactly. It was a presence, the distinct, undeniable sensation of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I froze mid-step, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I turned my head, scanning the shadows of the empty storefronts and crumbling houses that lined the square. At first, I saw nothing, just the darkness, too deep and too still. But then, in the corner of my vision, something moved. It was subtle, a flicker of motion against the stagnant backdrop, but it was enough to send a cold rush of adrenaline through me. I squinted, my eyes straining to adjust to the dim light. The movement came again, this time more distinct. A shadow, taller than it should have been, passed between two buildings at the far edge of the square. It didn't move like a person. It was too fluid, too fast, as if it wasn't bound by the same rules as the rest of us. My hand instinctively went to the camera, slung over my shoulder. I raised it, adjusting the lens with practiced movements, and aimed it toward the spot where I'd seen the shadow. Through the viewfinder, the world came into sharper focus, the darkened corners of the square, revealing details my eyes had missed. There was nothing there. I lowered the camera, my heartbeat slowing, just enough for doubt to creep in. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, the result of exhaustion and the eerie atmosphere. But the feeling of being watched didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. A sudden rustling sound snapped me out of my thoughts. Envy. It came from my left, near the gas station. My head jerked toward the noise, and I caught a glimpse of movement again, this time closer. The shadow darted behind the rusted shell of an old truck, its form barely visible in the faint light. I forced my feet to move, stepping cautiously toward the gas station. And you the kind of you just action I do know to my land. The crunch of gravel underfoot sounded deafening, and every step felt heavier than the last. My flashlight was clipped to my bag, and I fumbled to retrieve it, the beam slicing through the darkness as I clicked it on. The truck came into view, its once bright paint now faded and peeling. The windows were shattered, and moss crept along its sides like veins. I approached slowly, the flashlight shaking slightly in my grip. My mind raced with possibilities. An animal, perhaps? Someone else in the town? But deep down, I knew neither explanation fit. As I rounded the back of the truck, the flashlight beam illuminated the ground, revealing tracks in the dirt. They weren't footprints, not exactly. They were too elongated, the impressions deep and uneven, as if whatever had made them had dragged itself along the ground. My stomach twisted as I crouched to examine them, the reality of their existence settling over me like a weight. A sharp noise behind me made me whip around, the flashlight beam darting wildly. My heart slammed against my ribs as I searched the darkness, expecting to see something or someone lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, just a faint rustle of leaves. In the distance, the flashlight caught something on the edge of its beam, a mark etched into the side of the gas station. I stepped closer, my fear momentarily eclipsed by curiosity. The mark was a spiral carved deep into the wood, its edges jagged as though made in haste. It was identical to the symbol I'd seen in the church attic. My pulse quickened as I ran my fingers over the carving. The wood was cold, almost unnaturally so, and the spiral seemed to pulse faintly under my touch. A faint vibration traveled up my hand, and I pulled back sharply, my breathing shallow. The mark wasn't just a warning. It was a conduit, a tether to whatever force had taken hold of Black Hollow. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the square, carrying with it a sound that made my blood run cold. It wasn't the low tone I'd heard earlier. This was different. It was a whisper, faint and fragmented, as if carried on the breeze from some distant place. The words were indecipherable, but the tone was unmistakable. Urgent, pleading, and laced with something dark. I spun around, my flashlight darting across the square, but the whispering didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, filling the air around me like an unseen presence. I clutched the camera to my chest, my mind racing for an explanation, a plan, anything. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, the kind that pressed against my ears and made my own breathing sound deafening. I stood there, frozen, the flashlight beam trembling as it illuminated the empty square. A single word broke the silence, low and guttural, spoken from somewhere deep in the shadows. Claire. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a greeting. It was a summons. Ah, the word hung in the air, low and guttural, sending a chill through my entire body. My name, spoken in a voice that didn't belong to anything human, echoed faintly across the empty square. My grip tightened on the flashlight, its beam cutting jagged paths through the oppressive dark. My instinct was to run. Enwa, tel tut. Every part of me screamed to turn back, to flee toward the safety of my car, and get as far from Black Hollow as possible. But my feet didn't move. I was rooted in place, my pulse hammering in my ears, the weight of that single word pinning me to the ground. Claire. It came again, this time softer, more deliberate, like a whisper meant just for me. I turned slowly, the light trembling in my hands as I scanned the shadows. The town felt different now, alive in a way that defied reason. The air was heavier, thick, with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the darkness itself seemed to pulse with an unseen energy. The gas station stood to my left, its faded sign swaying gently on rusted hinges. To my right, the church loomed against the night sky, its steeple barely visible through the encroaching mist. But ahead, where the square gave way to the forest, something moved. At first, it was barely more than a flicker, a ripple of shadow against the dense line of trees. But as I focused, I saw it clearly. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing just at the edge of the woods. It didn't move, but the way it stood, the way it leaned forward, as if listening, made my skin crawl. My breath came in shallow gasps as I raised the flashlight, the beam slicing through the gloom and landing on the figure. It didn't flinch, didn't react at all, as if the light couldn't touch it. Its face, or what should have been its face, was smooth and featureless, a blank expanse of pale skin that seemed to ripple faintly, like water disturbed by a stone. I took an involuntary step back, my boots scraping against the gravel. The figure tilted its head, the movement sharp and unnatural, and the whispers returned. They weren't words anymore, just a low rhythmic hum that reverberated in my skull, drowning out my thoughts. Then it started to move. It didn't walk. It glided, its limbs too long, and its movements too fluid, like a shadow given form. My flashlight flickered as it approached, the beam dimming and brightening in rapid succession. The air grew colder, each breath forming faint clouds that dissipated almost immediately. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight as I turned and ran. My boots pounded against the ground, the sound muffled by the unnatural silence that blanketed the town. The whispers followed, growing louder, each one pulling at the edges of my mind like claws. I didn't stop until I reached the car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the door handle, yanking it open and throwing myself inside. The flashlight clattered to the floor, its beam casting jagged shadows across the dashboard. I locked the doors and gripped the steering wheel, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. For a moment, the world was still. LV. The whispers had stopped, the figure nowhere to be seen. I reached for the keys, my fingers brushing against the cool metal, when the air inside the car changed. It was subtle at first, a faint shift, like the atmosphere growing denser. The smell of damp earth filled my nostrils. Stronger now, almost suffocating. And then I felt it, the undeniable sensation of someone, or something, sitting in the passenger seat. I turned my head slowly, every nerve in my body screaming for me to stop. The figure was there, its faceless head turned toward me, its presence overwhelming. The whispers started again, louder now, filling the small space of the car, until it felt like they were coming from inside my own mind. The mark on my hand burned cold, the pain sharp and searing. I clutched at it instinctively, my breath catching in my throat as the figure leaned closer. Its head tilted again, and though it had no eyes, I could feel it staring directly at me. "You opened the door," it said, the words not spoken aloud, but echoing inside my head. "No, you cannot close it." "Ah!" I screamed, my voice raw and desperate, and slammed my fist into the car's ignition. The engine roared to life, the sound startlingly loud against the oppressive silence. I didn't wait. My foot hit the gas, the tires screeching as I tore out of the square, the headlights illuminating the empty road ahead. The whispers didn't stop. They followed me, clinging to the edges of my consciousness, growing fainter but never fully fading. The mark on my hand throbbed with a steady, rhythmic pulse, its glow faint but unrelenting. I didn't stop driving until the town was far behind me, the forest thinning as the road stretched out into open fields. My hands ached from gripping the steering wheel, my knuckles white and bloodless. I pulled over to the side of the road, the car idling, as I tried to steady my breathing. For the first time since entering Black Hollow, I felt the weight begin to lift, the oppressive presence easing just enough for me to think clearly. But as I sat there, staring at the empty stretch of road ahead, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The whispers had followed me, and I wasn't sure they would ever let me go. The road stretched endlessly before me, a ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through the dark expanse of fields and forest. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles aching from the pressure, but I couldn't bring myself to loosen my hold. The headlights carved two pale beams through the blackness, revealing nothing but emptiness, no shadows, no figures. But the mark on my hand still burned, cold and relentless, as if it were trying to remind me that whatever had started back in Black Hollow wasn't finished. The whispers were gone, or at least they had faded to the edges of my mind, but the memory of them lingered, a constant, nagging echo that made my thoughts feel heavy and disjointed. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though the car was empty. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror every few seconds, expecting to see that thing. The figure with its blank, rippling face, sitting in the back seat. Each time, it wasn't there, and each time, the dread grew worse. The thought of going back to Black Hollow gnawed at me, a strange mix of fear and inevitability. I had escaped, but I couldn't bring myself to believe I was free. The mark on my hand pulsed faintly in time with my heartbeat, a cold ache that spread up my arm. I glanced at it, the faint glow casting eerie shadows across the dashboard. It wasn't just a mark. It was a tether, a connection to whatever dark force had taken hold of that town. And it wasn't going to let me go. The car's engine hummed steadily, a monotonous backdrop to the chaos in my head. The road signs blurred as I passed them, each one a reminder that I was putting distance between myself and the horrors of Black Hollow. But the further I drove, the stronger the pull became. It wasn't physical. There was no invisible hand dragging me back, but it was undeniable, like a weight in my chest, a voice I couldn't quite hear whispering for me to turn around. And then, without meaning to, I did. My hands moved on their own, guiding the car into a slow U-turn. The headlights swung across the empty fields, illuminating the jagged silhouettes of distant trees. I pressed my foot to the brake, my chest tightening as I tried to fight the compulsion. My hands trembled against the wheel, the mark on my skin flaring with icy heat. "You have to go back," the voice whispered, low and insistent. It wasn't my voice. It wasn't even inside my head. It was outside, everywhere, carried on the cold night air. I glanced around wildly, but the road was still empty, the fields dark and silent. I slammed my hand against the steering wheel, a sharp, frustrated sound that cut through the oppressive quiet. "Leave me alone." "Envelop, dictus," I shouted, my voice cracking. But the moment the words left my mouth, I regretted them. The air around me seemed to shift, growing heavier, colder. The headlights flickered, the car stuttering briefly before roaring back to life. I gritted my teeth and turned the car back toward Black Hollow. The drive felt shorter this time, as though the town was pulling me in. The darkness grew deeper as I approached, the air heavier with each passing mile. By the time I reached the outskirts, the trees seemed to close in, their gnarled branches arching over the road like skeletal hands. The scent of damp earth filled the car, and the faint sound of whispering returned, so soft it could have been mistaken for wind. I parked at the edge of the town square, my headlights casting long shadows across the crumbling buildings. The church stood in the distance, its steeple jutting into the night sky like a jagged tooth. I didn't want to get out of the car. Every instinct told me to stay inside, to turn around again and keep driving until I reached somewhere. Anywhere else. But the pull was stronger now, an invisible thread yanking me toward the heart of the town. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the car, the sound of the door slamming far too loud in the oppressive quiet. The air was colder than before, the kind of cold that settled deep into your bones. I shivered and adjusted the strap of my bag, my fingers brushing against the journal tucked inside. Its presence was both comforting and unnerving, a reminder that I wasn't imagining any of this. The whispers grew louder as I approached the church, their chaotic rhythm weaving together into something almost melodic. They weren't just sounds anymore. And they were words, fragments of sentences spoken in a language I couldn't understand, but instinctively feared. The flashlight beam wavered as my hands began to shake, the light flickering across the warped wood of the church door. It was already open. I stepped inside, the scent of decay hitting me like a wall. The interior was just as I'd left it. Broken pews, warped floorboards, and the faint remnants of symbols scratched into the walls. But something had changed. The altar at the front of the room, once bare, now held something I couldn't quite make out. I moved closer, my footsteps echoing in the silence, the whispers growing louder with each step. It was a mirror. The frame was ornate, blackened with age, and its surface was cracked, the jagged lines distorting the reflection. But it wasn't my reflection staring back at me. It was something else, something wrong. The face was pale and featureless, rippling faintly as though it were made of water. And then it moved. My legs locked in place as the thing in the mirror tilted its head, its blank face somehow staring directly at me. The whispers reached a crescendo, the sound so loud it felt like my skull was splitting. The mark on my hand flared with an unbearable cold, and I doubled over, clutching it as pain shot through my arm. "You shouldn't have come back," the voice said, clear and sharp, cutting through the chaos. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was real, tangible, and it was coming from behind me. I turned slowly, my flashlight shaking as it illuminated the empty church. But it wasn't empty. The figure was there, standing in the aisle, its tall, thin form shrouded in shadows, its head tilted again, mimicking the movement I'd seen in the mirror. And it took a step forward. The door slammed shut behind me. The sound of the door slamming was like a gunshot in the suffocating silence. My breath caught in my throat, my grip on the flashlight tightening until my knuckles ached. The figure in the aisle stood motionless, its blank face tilted in that unnerving way, as if it was waiting for me to speak, or to run. The whispers didn't stop this time. They grew louder, more frantic, weaving a chaotic melody that filled every corner of the church. My skin prickled with the sensation of unseen eyes crawling over me. The mark on my hand throbbed in time with the whispers, a cold pulse that seemed to sync with the presence of the figure. The flashlight beam flickered as I took a shaky step back. The figure moved too, but it didn't walk. It glided, its long, distorted form rippling like a reflection on disturbed water. My stomach twisted as it drew closer, its featureless head lowering slightly, as if studying me. "You opened the door," the voice said, though the figure's blank face remained unmoving. The words weren't loud, but they carried weight, sinking into my chest like stones. "And now, it cannot be closed." I wanted to speak, to demand answers, but my throat felt like it had been filled with sand. Instead, I stumbled back toward the altar, the jagged edges of the broken mirror catching the light. The whispers surged, more distinct now, their fragmented words forming something almost coherent. The mirror, my gaze snapped to it, the fractured surface reflecting a distorted version of the room. The figure wasn't in the reflection. It was just me, pale and trembling, the mark on my hand glowing faintly in the cracked glass. And then, slowly, the reflection began to change. At first, it was subtle. A shift in the way the light hit my face. The faintest ripple along the edges of my form. But then, it grew more pronounced. My reflection tilted its head, its movements eerily identical to the figure behind me. My stomach churned as the mark on my reflection's hand flared brighter, spreading up its arm in jagged lines that shimmered with cold, unnatural light. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, the sound grating against my mind like nails on a chalkboard. I clutched my head, the flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. The church seemed to spin around me, the walls warping and bending as though the building itself was alive. "You must choose," the voice said, cutting through the chaos. The figure was closer now, looming over me, its head tilted again, the motion sharp and unnatural. "The door is open. Balance must be restored. What do you want from me?" I choked out, my voice cracking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it gestured toward the mirror. The fractured surface shimmered, the distorted reflection twisting and reforming until it showed something else entirely. It was the town square, bathed in an eerie, pale light. Figures moved through the space, vague shapes, their features blurred as if seen through fogged glass. They weren't people. Not anymore. "Lith, envelop," said Day. They moved in jerky, unnatural patterns, their heads snapping toward the church in unison. My chest tightened as I realized they were looking at me. "The echo demands balance," the voice said again, its tone almost serene. "One must stay." "You are." The mark on my hand flared brighter, the cold spreading up my arm and into my chest. I stumbled back, my legs hitting the edge of the altar. My eyes darted between the mirror and the figure, my mind racing. The images in the glass shifted again, faster now, cycling through scenes that didn't make sense. The forest, the symbols carved into the trees, the hollow faces of the figures in the square. All of it was wrong, fractured, like a puzzle missing too many pieces. I couldn't breathe. The cold was overwhelming now, pressing down on me from all sides. The whispers were in my head, my ears, my chest, threatening to tear me apart from the inside. "You are marked," the figure said, its voice filling the air around me. "You are bound. Choose." "What does that mean?" I shouted, the words ripped from my throat. "Choose what?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't need to. The answer was already clawing its way into my mind. The truth, a jagged, inescapable thing. The whispers weren't voices. They were echoes, fragments of the people who had come before me, trapped in this place, bound to the thing that now stood before me. The mark wasn't just a connection. It was a contract. The mirror shimmered again, the images solidifying into something clearer. A figure stood at the edge of the forest, its hand raised as if reaching for me. It wasn't the faceless thing from the church. It was someone else. someone real. Their face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel their desperation, their plea for release. I had to choose. Annoy. One of us would stay. One of us would take their place. The whispers fell silent, the sudden absence of sound, leaving my ears ringing. The figure stepped closer, its featureless face inches from mine. The cold seeped deeper, wrapping around my heart like frost. Decide, it said. I closed my eyes, the weight of the choice crushing me. The silence was worse than the whispers. Mean, it pressed against me, heavy and suffocating, filling the room with a stillness so absolute that even my own breathing felt intrusive. My eyes stayed shut, my chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven bursts as the cold wrapped tighter around me. The figure's presence loomed closer, its weight tangible, a shadow that I couldn't see but felt sinking into every corner of my mind. The mirror pulsed behind me, the fractured surface radiating faint, rhythmic waves of light that I could see even through my closed lids. Images flickered there, vivid and unrelenting, burning into my thoughts with brutal clarity. The town square, the forest, the empty faces of the figures caught in limbo. Each scene felt like a choice, a fragment of something larger, demanding resolution. You cannot wait forever, the voice murmured, close enough to send an icy shiver down my spine. The balance must be restored. The door must be sealed. I opened my eyes reluctantly, my gaze locking onto the mirror. The fractured images shifted again, moving faster now, like a film reel spinning out of control. But one image lingered longer than the rest, a clearing deep in the forest, bathed in a pale, unnatural light. At its center stood another altar, almost identical to the one in the church, but surrounded by figures, shadows of people, their forms distorted and barely human. I turned back to the figure, its blank face tilted slightly, waiting. I don't understand, I said, my voice breaking. Why me? I didn't open anything. The figure didn't move, but its presence seemed to grow heavier, filling the room with a palpable weight. The mark chose you, it said simply. You carry the tether. You are bound to the hollow. The mark on my hand burned colder, the pain radiating up my arm in jagged, icy waves. I clutched at it, trying to will the sensation away, but it only grew stronger, sharper, until it felt as though my skin might crack and splinter. The hollow doesn't choose at random, the voice continued. It knows your fear, your desperation, your desire to escape. Escape. The word hit me like a blow, and I staggered back, my legs buckling against the edge of the altar. Memories surged to the surface, fragmented flashes of a life spent running, of choices made in fear, of losses I'd tried to bury under layers of denial. The town wasn't just pulling me back, it was reflecting me, amplifying the cracks I'd tried so hard to hide. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stared at the mirror again. The clearing was still there, the figures unmoving, but now I could see someone standing at the altar. Not A shadow. A person. Their face was obscured, but their posture was unmistakable. Rigid, defiant, and utterly alone. It requires sacrifice. The voice said, almost gentle now. To close the door, one must stay. The mark demands it. The reality of the choice hit me with the force of a tidal wave. The figure in the mirror wasn't just a reflection. It was me, or what I would become if I stayed, trapped in the hollow, tethered to the mark, forever part of the echoing cycle that had consumed this place for decades. No, I whispered, shaking my head. There has to be another way. There is no other way, the figure said, its voice as cold and unyielding as the mark on my hand. You are bound. The hollow will claim its balance. The images in the mirror changed again, shifting to show the figures in the town square. They weren't moving now. They were watching, their hollow faces turned toward the church. Their eyes, if they had eyes, fixed on me, waiting. I felt the walls closing in, the oppressive weight of the hollow pressing against my chest. The whispers had returned, softer this time, weaving a cruel melody that drowned out my thoughts. My hands trembled as I turned back to the figure. What happens if I don't choose? I asked, though I wasn't sure. I wanted the answer. The figure tilted its head, its form rippling faintly as though amused. The door remains open. The hollow will spread. The balance will collapse, and all will fall into its grasp. I swallowed hard, my throat dry and aching. The weight of the choice was unbearable, a suffocating pressure that threatened to break me entirely. My mind raced, searching for a way out, a loophole, something that didn't end with me trapped in this nightmare. But there wasn't one. The mark on my hand pulsed again, its light growing brighter, harsher, until it illuminated the entire room. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming, and I felt my knees buckle beneath me. You must decide, it said, its voice echoing like a distant storm. The hollow waits. My gaze locked onto the mirror one last time. The clearing was empty now, the altar bathed in a cold, unforgiving light, and in its place, the reflection of my own hollowed-out form stared back at me, a silent reminder of what was waiting if I stayed. The light from the mark on my hand burned brighter, so bright it felt like it was consuming me. It wasn't just on my skin anymore. It was under it, in my veins, pulsing with a rhythm that wasn't my own. The figure stood motionless, waiting, its presence like a weight on my chest. My legs felt weak, trembling as I stared at the fractured mirror, the clearing in its reflection now impossibly vivid. The altar in the mirror wasn't just a place. It was alive, breathing, its surface crawling with symbols that twisted and shifted like living things. The figures surrounding it had no faces, no features, just voids where human expressions should have been. They weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking beyond me, into the space where the figure loomed. You are running out of time, the voice said, cold and unrelenting. The balance must be restored. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened as I turned away from the mirror, my gaze locking onto the figure. It didn't move, but its presence seemed to grow, filling the room with a suffocating sense of inevitability. My voice broke as I spoke, the words raw and desperate. "What happens if I go?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. The figure tilted its head, the motion deliberate and slow, as though considering the question. "You will become part of the hollow," it said. You will be the tether. The echo will consume you, and you will ensure the door remains sealed. And if I don't, I whispered. The figure straightened, its blank face rippling faintly. "The hollow will spread. The balance will shatter. You know this." I stumbled back, the mark on my hand flaring again, sending a sharp, cold pain through my arm. My breath came in shallow gasps, each one scraping against my throat. The whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices layering over one another, pulling at the edges of my mind. The mirror pulsed with light, drawing my gaze back to its fractured surface. The clearing was empty again, the altar bathed in pale moonlight. But this time, I saw something else. A figure. Human, unlike the faceless forms surrounding it, stood at the edge of the clearing, their face obscured by shadows. They reached out, their hand trembling, and I felt an inexplicable pull toward them. It was me, not the hollowed, distorted reflection I'd seen before, but the version of me that still had hope, that hadn't been consumed by the endless, suffocating weight of this place. The sight of it made my chest ache, a sharp, twisting pain that felt like grief. "You are the door," the voice said again, cutting through the chaos. "And you must choose." The air in the room grew colder, the light from the mark casting jagged shadows across the walls. My thoughts raced, my mind screaming for a way out, a way to escape this impossible choice. But there was no escape. There never had been. The mark flared one final time, and the pain became unbearable. I dropped to my knees, clutching my arm, as the cold seeped into my chest, wrapping around my heart like frost. The figure stepped closer, its presence towering over me, and I felt the weight of the hollow pressing down, demanding an answer. I closed my eyes, my body trembling, as I whispered the words that sealed my fate. "I choose." The moment the words left my lips, the room exploded with light. The mark on my hand burned so brightly it seared into my vision, and the air filled with a deafening roar, like 1,000 voices crying out in unison. The figure didn't move, but its presence shifted, growing heavier and colder, until I thought it would crush me entirely. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, an oppressive void that filled the space where the whispers had been. I opened my eyes, my vision blurry and unfocused, and saw the mirror. It was whole now, its surface smooth and unbroken. reflecting only the empty room around me. The figure was gone. The mark on my hand remained. I staggered to my feet, my legs weak and unsteady, and looked around the church. The oppressive weight of the hollow had lifted, but the air was still heavy with something unnameable. I stepped toward the door, my movements slow and deliberate, as though the room itself might try to pull me back. Outside, the town was silent. The square was empty, the shadows still. The car was exactly where I'd left it, the headlights cutting through the darkness like twin beacons. I made my way toward it, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the car, I stopped and looked back at the church. The steeple loomed against the night sky, a jagged silhouette that seemed impossibly distant now. The mark on my hand pulsed faintly, a cold reminder of the choice I had made. As I climbed into the car and started the engine, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving something behind. Not just the town, but a part of myself. The hollow hadn't taken me, but it hadn't let me go either. The mark was still there, its faint glow a constant, unrelenting presence. I drove away, the headlights carving a path through the endless darkness. But I knew I hadn't escaped. The hollow wasn't just a place. It was a part of me now. A tether that I could never break. And somewhere, deep in the forest, the whispers began again. The house stood at the edge of the forest, its silhouette jagged and unnatural against the deepening twilight. I hadn't planned to stop there. It wasn't on the map, not part of the carefully outlined itinerary I'd crafted to guide my investigation. But something about it drew me in. The windows were shattered, the front door slightly ajar, and the air around it was disturbingly still. No wind stirred the grass. No birds sang in the trees. It felt as though the house itself had silenced the world. I parked my car a few feet from the gravel path leading to the porch, killing the engine to preserve what little fuel I had left. The silence was deafening. Even the crunch of my boots on the gravel felt intrusive, like I was breaking some unspoken rule. The backpack slung over my shoulder felt heavier than usual, every step closer to the house, adding to the weight. The smell hit me first, damp wood, rotting leaves, and something else, something acrid and metallic that made my stomach churn. I hesitated at the threshold, the decaying door creaking under the weight of my touch. The darkness inside was thick and unyielding, my flashlight barely cutting through it as I stepped over the warped wooden floorboard. The first thing I noticed was the absence of life. There were no cobwebs in the corners, no signs of rodents or insects. It was as though the house had been abandoned by more than just people. My beam swept across overturned furniture, scattered papers, and a cracked mirror leaning precariously against the far wall. The glass was smeared, with something dark and dry, and the edges of the frame were splintered as though it had been struck repeatedly. I stepped further inside, my breath shallow as I moved through the house. Each room told the same story. Chaos and emptiness. Chairs were overturned, drawers left open, their contents spilled onto the floor in frenzied heaps. And then, in the living room, I saw it. The chairs were arranged in a circle at the center of the room, their backs facing inward. It was a deliberate formation, precise and unnervingly symmetrical. On the wall behind them, words were scrawled in thick, jagged strokes. Don't look at it. The letters were uneven, smeared as though written in haste or fear. The flashlight trembled in my grip as I stepped closer to the circle. The chairs weren't just arranged. They were bolted to the floor, their legs fused with thick, rusted nails that jutted out at odd angles. The smell was stronger here, almost overpowering, and the air felt thicker, pressing against my chest with every breath. My eyes traced the scrawled words again, the warning sharp and visceral against the peeling wallpaper. Don't look at it. I couldn't stop myself from turning toward the wall opposite the writing. It was bare, save for faint scratches that crisscrossed the wood like desperate attempts to escape. Something about them felt off. They weren't random. They converged at the base of the wall, where a small hatch was embedded in the floor. The hatch was barely large enough for a person to fit through, its edges ringed with rust and what looked like claw marks. I crouched beside it, my flashlight casting a pale glow over the jagged lines that radiated outward. The handle was broken, hanging loose by a single screw, and the wood around it was splintered as though it had been forced open or shut. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to walk out of that house and never look back. But something about the hatch held me in place, a magnetic pull I couldn't resist. My hand moved on its own, the tips of my fingers brushing against the cold metal. It vibrated faintly beneath my touch, the sensation spreading through my arm like a low hum. The sound was so soft at first that I thought I'd imagined it, a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against wood, emanated from the hatch. I froze, my hand hovering above the handle. Every muscle in my body tensed. The sound grew louder, shifting to a series of faint taps, rhythmic and deliberate. My breath caught in my throat as I pressed my ear to the wood. There was something down there. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so complete it made my ears ring. I stumbled back, my heart pounding as I stared at the hatch. The words on the wall seemed to loom larger, their meaning sinking in with sudden clarity. I wasn't alone. The thought hit me like a jolt of electricity, and I scrambled to my feet, the flashlight beam darting frantically around the room. The shadows seemed deeper now, thicker, like they were alive. Every creak of the floorboards under my weight echoed too loudly, each one answered by the faintest shuffle of movement somewhere behind me. I spun around, the flashlight catching a fleeting shape, pale and indistinct, vanishing into the hallway. My breath hitched as I followed, my footsteps hesitant and uneven. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, the walls narrowing the farther I went. The air grew colder, each exhale forming faint clouds that dissipated too quickly. At the end of the hallway, a door stood slightly ajar. The light from my flashlight reflected off something metallic just inside the room, glinting faintly in the darkness. I stepped closer, the floor beneath me groaning in protest. My hand reached for the door, pushing it open with a low creak. The room was empty, save for a single object resting on the floor. A mirror. Its surface was cracked, the jagged lines distorting the faint reflection of the doorway behind me. I stepped closer, drawn to it despite every nerve in my body screaming to turn back. The closer I got, the clearer the reflection became. And you, the house, the galore. And then I saw it. A figure stood in the doorway behind me, its form tall and impossibly thin, its face obscured by shadow. It didn't move, didn't breathe. It just watched. My pulse thundered in my ears as I turned slowly, the flashlight shaking in my hand. There was nothing there. The air in the house felt colder now, sharp and biting, as though the shadows themselves carried the chill. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out the silence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the quiet wasn't empty. It felt alive, watching, waiting. The mirror on the floor reflected nothing but fractured light, its jagged surface slicing through my flashlight beam in chaotic patterns. I stared at it for a moment longer, my breath catching in my chest, before I turned away. I moved back into the hallway, the flashlight trembling in my hand as the narrow corridor seemed to stretch impossibly long. The faint creak of the floorboards under my boots felt deafening in the oppressive stillness. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the house itself was pressing down on me, urging me to leave, but holding me captive at the same time. As I neared the hatch again, the faint vibration beneath the floor returned. It was so subtle, like a distant hum carried through the wood. I stopped, crouching down to run my fingers over the warped surface. The sensation was faint, but rhythmic, pulsing in time with the unease building in my chest. Wow, something was there, something waiting just below the surface. I wanted to walk away, to leave the house behind, and pretend I hadn't seen the scrawled warnings, the circle of chairs, or the hatch that seemed to call out to me. But the pull was undeniable. My hand moved to the broken handle again, and this time I didn't stop myself. The wood gave with a sharp groan, the hatch creaking open just enough to release a burst of cold, damp air that smelled of earth and decay. I leaned back instinctively, my flashlight aimed into the darkness below. The beam illuminated rough, uneven walls that stretched down into what looked like a crawl space. The ground was dirt, disturbed in patches, and the walls were lined with faint scratches, like something had clawed its way through the confined space. I leaned closer, the flashlight trembling as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The silence in the house grew heavier, pressing against me like a weight. And then, faintly, I heard it. A whisper. It wasn't a voice. Not exactly. It was more like the memory of a sound. Faint and fleeting, barely audible over the rush of blood in my ears. But it was there, unmistakable, weaving through the cold air like a thread. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as the whisper came again, closer this time, curling around me like smoke. I should have closed the hatch. I should have turned around and left, but something kept me rooted to the spot, my hand tightening on the flashlight as the whisper grew louder. The sound was layered, fractured, like multiple voices speaking at once, overlapping in a chaotic rhythm that made my skin crawl. And then I saw it, just beyond the edge of the flashlight beam. Something moved. It was quick, almost imperceptible, like a flicker of shadow against the wall. My breath caught, and I shifted the light, my heart hammering as I strained to see deeper into the crawl space. The beam revealed nothing but dirt and scratches, the uneven walls receding into darkness. But I knew I wasn't alone. The whisper stopped suddenly, the abrupt silence so complete it felt like the air had been sucked from the room. I sat back on my heels, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The mark on the floor, just beyond the hatch, caught my attention again. The scratches converged in a spiral pattern, the edges jagged and uneven, as though they'd been carved with trembling hands. I reached out hesitantly, brushing my fingers over the marks. The surface was cold, unnaturally so, and the moment I touched it, a sharp, stinging sensation shot through my hand. I pulled back with a gasp, the flashlight beam swinging wildly as I cradled my hand against my chest. The spiral glowed faintly now, a sickly green light that pulsed in time with the vibrations in the floor. My breath came in shallow gasps as I backed away from the hatch, my legs unsteady. The house felt alive, the walls closing in around me as the faint hum grew louder, reverberating through the floorboards. The light from the spiral intensified, casting eerie shadows across the room. And then, from the darkness of the crawl space, I heard it, a single word, spoken in a voice that was low and guttural, like the scrape of stone against stone. Stay. Phew. The word echoed through the room, sinking into my chest like a physical weight. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering as the air grew colder, each breath forming faint clouds that disappeared. Almost instantly, my back hit the wall, the sharp edge of the hatch frame digging into my side as I tried to steady myself. The whispering started again, louder this time, and I could feel it, inside my head, behind my eyes, pulling at the edges of my thoughts. My vision blurred as I turned toward the door, the only thought in my mind to get out, to escape. But the house wouldn't let me go. The shadows in the hallway shifted, moving in ways that defied logic. Shapes flickered at the edges of my vision, darting just out of reach of the flashlight beam. My footsteps were unsteady as I moved toward the front door, my breath catching with every creak of the floorboards. The door was open, I hadn't left it that way. The cold air outside felt sharper now, like a barrier I wasn't meant to cross. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, the whispers growing into a cacophony that drowned out my thoughts. And then, just as my fingers brushed the cold metal, I saw it. A shadow stretched across the floor behind me, tall and impossibly thin, its form distorted and rippling like smoke caught in a breeze. My breath hitched, my muscles locking in place as I turned slowly, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The figure stood at the edge of the hallway, its blank face tilted as though watching me. It didn't move, but its presence filled the room, suffocating and unrelenting. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breathing. And then, in a voice that didn't belong to anything human, it spoke again. "You can't leave." The figure didn't move, but its presence filled the room like a weight pressing against my chest. My hand froze on the doorknob, the cold metal biting into my palm. As I tried to steady my breathing, its blank face, or the absence of one, tilted slightly, as though studying me. The air grew colder, the silence so dense it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The flashlight flickered, its beam stuttering as if reacting to the figure. The shadows around it didn't behave like normal shadows. They stretched and shifted unnaturally, coiling around its form like living things. My heart thundered in my chest, the sound deafening in the oppressive quiet. I wanted to run, to throw the door open and bolt into the night, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The voice came again, soft and deliberate, but carrying an undeniable force. "You can't leave." The words weren't loud, but they vibrated through the air, settling deep into my bones. They weren't a threat. They were a certainty. My breath hitched as the figure took a step forward, its movements fluid and unnatural, as though it wasn't bound by the same rules of motion as the rest of us. The flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor and casting erratic shadows across the walls. My eyes darted toward it instinctively, but I didn't dare look away from the figure for long. I could feel its gaze, though it had no eyes. A cold, unyielding presence that bore into me. My voice cracked as I forced myself to speak. "What do you want?" The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, it took another step, the faint sound of its movement sending a shiver down my spine. The whispers began again, faint and fragmented, like voices carried on a distant wind. They didn't come from the figure itself, but seemed to emanate from the house, from the very walls around me. I felt the air shift. A faint pull like the room itself was drawing me closer to the figure. My legs finally obeyed, and I stumbled back, my hands slipping off the doorknob as the door creaked closed behind me. The room darkened further, the only light now coming from the faint glow of the spiral marks on the floor near the hatch. "You brought it with you," the figure said, its voice overlapping with itself, layers of sound that made my ears ache. "The mark binds you." I looked down at my hand instinctively, but there was no mark on my skin, at least none that I could see. The figure tilted its head the other way, as though amused, and the whispers around me grew louder. The walls seemed to bend and shift, their edges blurring as if the room were no longer solid. The spiral marks on the floor pulsed faintly, their glow casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. The hatch beneath them seemed to shudder, a faint vibration rippling through the floorboards. The cold air grew sharper, cutting through me like shards of glass. "You opened the way," the figure said, its voice quieter now, but no less chilling. "And now you must stay." I shook my head, my voice trembling as I whispered, "I didn't open anything." The figure didn't answer. It didn't need to. The truth was there, in the marks, in the house, in the overwhelming sense of inevitability that hung in the air. I had crossed a line the moment I stepped into Silent Valley, into this house, and there was no going back. The whispers swelled, filling the room with a chaotic melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. At once, my hands flew to my ears instinctively, but it did nothing to dull the sound. The walls began to tremble, faint cracks spidering out from the edges of the room as the air grew heavier. The figure was closer now, though I hadn't seen it move. It loomed over me, its blank face inches from mine, and for a moment I thought I saw something in the void, shapes shifting beneath the surface, fleeting images that made no sense but filled me with a visceral dread. The spiral marks on the floor flared brighter, their glow flooding the room with unnatural light. I stumbled back, shielding my eyes as the whispers reached a crescendo. The air felt like it was being sucked out of the room, leaving me gasping for breath. And then, as suddenly as it began, the light and sound vanished. I opened my eyes slowly, my chest heaving as I tried to steady myself. The room was dark and still, the figure gone. The spiral marks were faint now, their glow barely visible against the warped floorboards. But the sense of dread remained, heavier than ever. "Shua, so, I do Decepticontish." I turned toward the door again, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. And this time, it turned easily, the door creaking open to reveal the cold, empty night outside. I stepped out onto the porch, the air sharp and biting against my skin. The silence of Silent Valley enveloped me once more. Oppressive and unyielding, the house stood behind me, its windows dark and empty, but I could still feel it watching. The mark wasn't just in the house. It was in me now, a tether I couldn't break. I looked down at my hand again, turning it over under the pale moonlight, but there was nothing there, and yet I could feel it. The air outside the house felt heavier than it should have, pressing against my chest with an unnatural weight. The silence stretched endlessly, broken only by the faint crunch of gravel under my boots as I moved toward my car. The house behind me stood still and dark, but its presence lingered, a shadow etched into my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. Even as I turned my back to it, I slid into the driver's seat, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. The engine sputtered to life, the sound jarringly loud against the suffocating quiet. My headlights cut through the dark, illuminating the overgrown road ahead. But the light felt weak, swallowed by the shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly around me. My grip tightened on the steering wheel as I pulled onto the narrow path leading out of Silent Valley. The forest loomed on either side, its twisted branches reaching overhead like skeletal fingers. The farther I drove, the more the trees seemed to close in, their shadows deepening until it felt like I was driving through a tunnel carved from darkness. And then the whispers began again. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the hum of the engine. But as the road twisted and turned, they grew louder, weaving through the air like a melody just out of reach. I clenched my teeth, my knuckles whitening as I gripped the wheel tighter. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. The mark on my hand throbbed faintly, an icy pulse that spread up my arm and settled in my chest. I glanced down briefly, but my skin looked normal, unmarked, unblemished. And yet, the sensation was undeniable. A constant reminder of something I couldn't see, but could feel deeply, intimately. The road ahead curved sharply, the headlights casting fleeting glimpses of gnarled roots and twisted vines that encroached onto the asphalt. My stomach twisted as I spotted something up ahead, a faint figure standing at the edge of the road. My foot hovered over the brake instinctively, my pulse quickening as I slowed the car. The figure didn't move. It was tall and thin, its form barely distinguishable from the shadows of the trees. As my headlight swept over it, I caught a glimpse of something pale. Its face, or what should have been a face. It was blank, featureless, yet somehow more terrifying than if it had been grotesque. The whispers swelled, louder now, wrapping around me like tendrils of smoke. The figure tilted its head, the movement sharp and unnatural, as though it were mimicking human behavior, but getting it just slightly wrong. My heart pounded as I pressed the gas pedal, the car lurching forward. The figure didn't react, but as I passed, I swore I saw its head snap toward me, following my motion with a precision that made my stomach lurch. The whispers didn't fade as I put distance between myself and the figure. They grew louder, more chaotic, as though they were inside the car with me. I turned the radio knob instinctively, but the speakers crackled with static, the faint hum of a broken signal, drowning beneath the layered voices. "You can't leave," one voice said, distinct and low, cutting through the noise. I slammed the brakes, the car skidding to a stop in the middle of the road. And my chest heaved as I struggled to steady my breathing, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly it felt like my fingers might break. The static faded, replaced by silence, so absolute it made my ears ring. And then I heard it, a faint rustling coming from somewhere just outside the car. I turned my head slowly, my gaze locking onto the forest beside me. The trees were still, their branches unmoving in the stagnant air, but something shifted in the shadows. A flicker of movement just out of reach of the headlights. My pulse raced as I reached for the flashlight in the passenger seat. The cold metal familiar, and grounding against my palm. I rolled down the window slowly, the crank squealing in protest. The flashlight's beam cut through the dark, illuminating the dense underbrush. At first, there was nothing, just tangled roots and leaves coated in a thin layer of dew. But then, deep within the shadows, I saw them. Eyes, no, they weren't human. They were too large, too reflective, catching the beam of my flashlight and glowing faintly like twin orbs of molten silver. They blinked once, slowly, and I felt my stomach drop. The whispers surged again, louder and more frantic, as though the presence in the forest had stirred something deeper, something older. The eyes moved closer. I dropped the flashlight in my panic, the beam casting erratic arcs across the trees as it hit the floor. My hands fumbled with the window crank, desperate to close the gap between myself and whatever was out there. The rustling grew louder, accompanied by the faintest sound of footsteps, deliberate, measured, and impossibly heavy. The window slammed shut, just as something collided with the side of the car. The impact rocked the vehicle, the sound of metal groaning under pressure filling the air. My scream caught in my throat as I turned to look. But the darkness outside was impenetrable, the flashlight's beam too weak to reveal what had hit me. I didn't wait to find out. My foot slammed against the gas pedal, the tires screeching as the car lurched forward. The whispers reached a fever pitch, the voices blending into a deafening roar that seemed to come from every direction. The mark on my hand burned colder than ever, the pain radiating up my arm and into my chest like a shard of ice. The road stretched on endlessly, the forest on either side growing denser, the trees leaning closer as though trying to swallow me whole. I drove faster, the car rattling beneath me as the engine roared in protest. The whispers faded slightly, replaced by a faint rhythmic hum that seemed to pulse in time with the mark. And then, without warning, the road ended. The car skidded to a halt, the tires kicking up a spray of gravel as I stared at what lay ahead. The road didn't just stop, it disappeared, swallowed by a dense wall of fog that stretched upward and outward, consuming everything in its path. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the air, through the car, through me. I sat frozen, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. As the fog began to shift, shapes moved within it, indistinct and fluid, their forms blurring and reforming like shadows cast on water. The whispers returned, quieter now, but no less insistent. You can't leave. The fog was alive. It twisted and writhed like a living thing, shapes forming and dissolving within its pale depth. My heart raced as I gripped the steering wheel tighter, the cold plastic biting into my palms. The hum in the air grew louder, vibrating through the car, into my chest, making my teeth ache. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The only thought pounding in my mind was that I had reached the edge of something I was never meant to see. Shapes began to emerge from the fog. Shapes began to emerge from the fog. At first, they were indistinct, just faint impressions of motion, But as they drew closer, they solidified. Figures, dozens of them. They weren't walking. They were gliding, their forms eerily smooth, unbroken by the natural hesitations of human movement. Their faces were blank voids, their edges blurring into the mist, as if they were more shadow than substance. The whispers returned, faint and layered, blending with the hum in a maddening rhythm. My hand moved to the gear shift, trembling as I forced myself to reverse. The engine growled in protest, the car lurching back slightly. But the figures didn't stop. They kept coming, their movements steady and deliberate, as though they had all the time in the world. And then the headlights flickered. The beam of light that had been my only anchor in the oppressive dark wavered, dimming before flaring back to life. The figures were closer now, their forms clearer. They were tall, impossibly so, their elongated limbs disproportionate to the rest of their bodies. Their heads tilted in unison, a sharp, jerky motion that made my stomach churn. I pressed the gas pedal instinctively, the car skidding backward as gravel crunched beneath the tires. The fog seemed to stretch, its edges curling toward the car like fingers. The whispers grew louder, more distinct now, words I couldn't understand layering over each other in a chaotic symphony. My pulse thundered in my ears as I glanced down at my hat. The mark was back. It glowed faintly, its edges etched into my skin with an unnatural precision. The cold spread from it, up my arm and into my chest, a biting chill that felt like it was burrowing into my bones. I clutched the wheel tighter, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I slammed the car into drive. The engine roared as I sped forward, the fog swallowing the road ahead. The figures didn't chase me. They didn't need to. The whispers followed, clinging to the air like smoke, filling the space around me with their incessant, maddening presence. The road twisted sharply, the forest closing in on either side, and I fought to keep the car steady. Every shadow felt alive, every flicker of movement at the edges of my vision, threatening to break what little grip I had on reality. And then I saw it, standing in the middle of the road, its form illuminated by the flickering headlights, was the figure from the house. It was taller now, its limbs stretched unnaturally, its head tilted at an impossible angle. The void where its face should have been seemed deeper, darker, pulling at my vision like a black hole. I couldn't stop. You, he, hi. The car hurtled toward it, the headlights glaring against its pale, featureless body. My hands locked on the wheel, my foot pressing the brake to the floor. The tires screeched, the car skidding uncontrollably, and for a split second I thought I was going to hit it. But the moment the car should have collided with the figure, it vanished. The car jerked to a halt, the engine stalling. My chest heaved as I clung to the steering wheel, my knuckles white with tension. The whispers had stopped. The fog was gone. The road ahead stretched empty and dark. The oppressive weight that had been pressing against me suddenly lifting. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtering before roaring back to life. My hands shook as I shifted into drive, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty, but I could still feel it. The presence, the weight of something unseen lingering just beyond the edge of the light. The mark on my hand pulsed faintly, a cold reminder that I hadn't escaped. I gritted my teeth and pressed the gas, the car surging forward as I focused on the road ahead. The forest thinned as the road straightened, the suffocating shadows giving way to open space. For a moment, I thought I might finally be free. And then the whispers returned. They were louder now, more insistent, wrapping around me like chains. Ulna. The mark flared, the cold spreading through my body in jagged bursts, and the car jerked violently to the side. My hands flew to the wheel, struggling to keep control as the tires skidded on loose gravel. The road ended abruptly, the asphalt giving way to dirt and overgrown weeds. The car slowed to a crawl as I realized I wasn't on the main road anymore. I didn't remember turning, but the path ahead was unfamiliar, flanked by gnarled trees that seemed to lean closer with every passing second. The headlights illuminated a clearing up ahead, a wide expanse of bare earth surrounded by the dense forest. At its center stood an altar, rough, uneven stone covered in jagged symbols that glowed faintly in the dark. My stomach twisted as I brought the car to a stop, the engine idling as I stared at the altar. The whispers were deafening now, each word digging into my mind like claws. The mark on my hand burned brighter, the pain so intense it brought tears to my eyes. I clutched my arm, my breath coming in shallow gasps as the door to the car creaked open on its own. I didn't move. I couldn't. The air outside was freezing, the cold seeping into the car as the altar pulsed with an eerie light. Shadows moved at the edges of the clearing, their forms flickering and indistinct, but I didn't need to see them to know what they were. They were waiting. The clearing seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, a slow, deliberate heartbeat that I could feel reverberating through the ground, through the car, and into my chest. The engine hummed faintly, a pathetic protest against the overwhelming silence that now engulfed everything around me. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, but I couldn't force my foot onto the gas. I couldn't move. The altar in the center of the clearing was ancient, its surface jagged and uneven. Symbols etched into the stone glowed faintly, casting an otherworldly light that illuminated the surrounding trees. The shadows at the edges of the clearing shifted and writhed, moving with an unnatural fluidity that made my stomach churn. They weren't attached to anything. They simply existed, alive and independent, stretching toward the altar as though drawn to it. The mark on my hand throbbed in time with the light from the symbols, a cold, searing pain that spread up my arm and into my chest. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, fogging the windshield as I stared at the altar, unable to look away. It was calling me. I didn't know how I knew that, but I did. The pull was undeniable, like an invisible thread wrapped around my ribs, dragging me forward, even as every instinct screamed for me to stay in the car. The door creaked open again, the sound impossibly loud in the oppressive silence. The air outside was colder than anything I'd ever felt, a biting chill that made my skin prickle and my breath hitch. I stepped out of the car before I could stop myself, my boots sinking into the soft dirt of the clearing. The whispers returned, louder, now, each word pressing against the inside of my skull like a vise. I clutched my head, staggering forward as the pull of the altar grew stronger. The shadows moved closer, their forms still indistinct but undeniably present. They swirled around the edge of the clearing, never crossing into the light cast by the altar, but circling it like predators, waiting for their moment. The whispers weren't just noise anymore. Inabuli, they were words, fractured and overlapping, but I could understand them now. Come closer. Kelly, ka, tiumtikiti. You've been chosen. The balance must be restored. The altar loomed ahead of me, its light growing brighter with every step I took. The mark on my hand burned cold, the pain now sharp and unbearable, as though it was reacting to the energy radiating from the stone. My legs felt heavy, each step a monumental effort, as I approached the center of the clearing. And I saw it. Carved into the surface of the altar was a spiral identical to the mark on my hand, but larger, deeper, its lines jagged and uneven. The glow emanating from it was alive, shifting and pulsing like a heartbeat. Around the edges of the stone were dark stains, old and dried, but unmistakable. My stomach churned as I realized what they were. Blood. Blood. I reached the altar, my body trembling as I placed a hand on the rough stone. The instant my skin touched it, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing against my ears like a physical force. The mark on my hand flared, its glow so bright it illuminated the clearing, casting sharp shadows that danced and writhed like living things. The air shifted, growing colder and heavier. I felt a presence behind me, looming and suffocating. My breath hitched as I turned slowly, my eyes locking onto the figure that now stood at the edge of the clearing. It was the same figure I'd seen before, tall, impossibly thin, its blank face tilted slightly, as though watching me. But this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, the shadows had taken shape, dozens of them, their forms flickering and indistinct but undeniably human. Their faces were obscured, but I could feel their gaze, cold and unrelenting, fixed on me. The figure stepped closer, its movements fluid and deliberate. The shadows followed, their steps silent as they closed in around the altar. My chest tightened, my pulse pounding in my ears as the figure stopped, just feet away from me. It raised a hand, long and skeletal, and pointed to the altar. "You know what must be done," it said, its voice low and resonant, reverberating through the clearing. It wasn't a question, it was a command. I shook my head, my voice trembling as I whispered, "I don't understand." The figure tilted its head the other way, its blank face rippling faintly. The balance has been broken. The hollow requires a sacrifice. The words hit me like a blow, the weight of their meaning sinking into my chest. My knees buckled, and I gripped the edge of the altar for support, the cold stone biting into my palms. The whispers began again, softer this time, as though coaxing me, urging me forward. The mark on my hand pulsed once more, the pain so intense that I cried out, collapsing to my knees. The figure stepped closer, towering over me as the shadows encircled the altar, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke. I looked up at the figure, my vision blurred by tears and pain. What happens if I refuse? I asked, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond immediately. It simply stared, or at least I thought it was staring, its faceless head unchanging. When it spoke again, its voice was colder, harsher. The hollow will consume all. The door must be sealed. My chest heaved as I tried to steady my breathing, my thoughts racing. The weight of the choice was suffocating, an impossible burden that pressed down on me from all sides. I looked at the spiral on the altar, its glow pulsing in time with the mark on my hand. I knew what it wanted. I knew what it meant. And I knew there was no way out. The cold seeped into my bones, wrapping around my chest like icy vines. My hand remained pressed against the altar, the mark on my skin glowing brighter, pulsing in time with the faint hum that filled the clearing. The figure stood over me, unmoving, its presence suffocating. The shadows at the edge of the light writhed in silent anticipation, their forms flickering like static caught in a storm. I couldn't breathe. Every fiber of my being screamed to run, to fight, to do anything but remain here, trapped in this impossible moment. But I knew there was no escaping this. The hollow wouldn't let me leave, not without a price. The weight of the choice settled over me, heavy and crushing. The figure raised its arm, a long skeletal finger pointing toward the spiral etched into the altar. Its voice cut through the silence, low and resonant, like the groan of ancient stone. Seal the door. I'll aim to use the door. The whispers swelled again, surrounding me, pulling at the edges of my mind. They weren't chaotic anymore. They were clear, deliberate, each word sinking into me like a knife. It must be done. It's mind. One must stay. Restore the balance. Tears burned my eyes as I stared at the altar. The spiral glowed with an unnatural light, its jagged lines almost hypnotic. My hand moved without thinking, drawn toward the center of the mark, as though the pull of gravity itself had shifted. The moment my palm pressed against it, a shock of cold shot through my arm, and the whispers ceased. The silence was unbearable. The air around me seemed to freeze, the faint hum from the altar growing louder until it resonated in my chest. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I wasn't in the clearing anymore. I saw the forest, ancient and endless, its trees twisted and gnarled. I saw the town, Silent Valley, as it once was, alive, thriving, filled with people who had no idea what lay beneath their feet. And then I saw the truth. The hollow wasn't just a place. It was a hunger, a force that consumed and twisted, feeding on those who dared to linger too long. The altar wasn't a seal. It was a tether, a fragile barrier that kept the hollow from spilling out into the world beyond. And now, the tether was breaking. The images flashed faster now. Fragments of lives swallowed by the hollow faces, contorted in terror as they were pulled into the darkness. I saw the spiral over and over, carved into trees, etched into stone, burned into flesh. It wasn't just a mark. It was a brand, a promise, a binding contract, and I was bound. My vision snapped back to the clearing, the cold air slicing into my lungs as I gasped. The figure stood closer now, its blank face tilted downward, watching me. The shadows had stopped moving, their forms solidifying into shapes that were almost human. They surrounded me, silent and waiting. "You are the door," the figure said, its voice soft but unyielding, "and the door must be closed." The mark on my hand flared, the pain radiating through my body like shards of ice. I cried out, collapsing against the altar, my knees digging into the frozen ground. The spiral glowed brighter, its light washing over the clearing, illuminating the shadows, the figure, the twisted trees beyond. And then something shifted. The air grew heavier, the hum deepening into a low, resonant drone that vibrated through the earth. The shadows began to dissolve, their forms unraveling into wisps of smoke that swirled toward the altar. The figure stepped back, its head tilting one last time before it too began to fade, its edges blurring into the light. The mark on my hand burned cold and bright, the glow spreading up my arm and across my chest. My vision dimmed, my body trembling as the altar seemed to rise beneath me, pulling me into its light. The whispers returned, softer now, almost gentle, as though they were comforting me. "It is done. Shiwen. It's done. And I. You don't all call duty. The door is sealed. You are the balance." Oh, I don't know how long I knelt there, my hand pressed against the spiral, the cold consuming me. Time didn't exist in the hollow. There was only the silence, the weight, the endless pull of the mark. When I finally opened my eyes, the clearing was empty. The altar was dark, the spiral faint and lifeless. The shadows were gone, the figure nowhere to be seen. But the mark on my hand remained, its glow dim but steady, a constant reminder of the price that had been paid. I staggered to my feet, my legs unsteady as I stumbled back toward the car. The air felt lighter now, the oppressive weight of the hollow lifting just enough for me to breathe. I climbed into the driver's seat, my hands trembling as I turned the key. The engine sputtered, then roared to life, and I pulled away from the clearing without looking back. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the forest thinning as the first faint light of dawn broke through the trees. But the mark on my hand still pulsed faintly, its cold presence a reminder that the hollow wasn't gone. It was a part of me now. Diudvowes boal. It was a part of me now. The mountain was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that wrapped around you like a thick fog, pressing into your ears and filling your chest with an unease you couldn't shake. My boots scraped against the loose gravel as I approached the cave's jagged opening. The air here was colder, sharper, carrying the faint metallic tang of damp stone. And something else I couldn't place. Something sour, almost like rot. The collapsed site spread out before me, a chaotic mess of splintered trees and jagged boulders. It looked like the mountain had exhaled, violently expelling centuries of buried earth. At the center of it all, the newly revealed cave gaped like a wound, its shadows deeper than they should have been, even in the fading light of late afternoon. My breath fogged in the air as I stepped closer, the ground shifting slightly beneath my weight. The cave wasn't on any map. That's why they'd sent me. Unstable geology, the report had said. Unexplained seismic activity. I'd seen landslides before, even investigated collapses like this. But standing here, staring into that black void, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was different. My equipment bag felt heavier than usual as I set it down near the entrance, the strap biting into my shoulder. The first task was simple. Set up the sensors to monitor for any further movement. But my eyes kept drifting to the darkness, just beyond the threshold, where the shadows seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. I tried to focus, unzipping the bag and pulling out the first sensor. My fingers felt clumsy, fumbling with the small device, as an inexplicable chill settled over me. The cold was worse near the cave, cutting through my jacket and sinking into my skin. I glanced over my shoulder at the sheriff, who stood a few yards back, his broad frame silhouetted against the gray sky. He hadn't said much since we'd arrived, but I could feel his unease. It hung between us, unspoken but heavy, like the air before a storm. He shifted his weight, his boots crunching against the gravel, and glanced toward the trees. The wind stirred the branches, the only sound breaking the suffocating stillness. And I heard it, a low, rhythmic hum, so faint I almost thought I'd imagined it. It seemed to come from deep within the cave, resonating through the stone and into the ground beneath my feet. I froze, the sensor slipping from my hand and landing with a soft thud in the dirt. The hum was steady, almost mechanical, but it carried a strange organic quality that set my teeth on edge. I stepped closer to the cave's edge, my flashlight trembling slightly as I raised it. The beam barely penetrated the darkness, illuminating only a few feet of rough, uneven walls before being swallowed by the void. The hum grew louder, vibrating faintly in my chest, and I couldn't help but take another step forward. The air inside the cave was colder still, almost freezing, and the smell was stronger here, earthy and metallic, with an underlying sweetness that made my stomach turn. The flashlight beam wavered as I adjusted my grip, the light catching on something just ahead, a glint of metal, sharp and out of place against the rough stone. I crouched down, my heart pounding as I reached out to brush away the dirt. It was a piece of twisted steel, rusted and ancient, partially embedded in the cave floor. Nearby, a scattering of bones gleamed faintly in the light, their surfaces smooth and polished, as if worn down by time or something worse. A sharp sound broke the stillness, a distant crack, like the snap of a branch. I whipped around, the flashlight swinging wildly, but the entrance was empty. The sheriff was gone. Eerie sounded alone, and my breath caught in my throat as I called out, my voice echoing uselessly in the cave. The only answer was the hum, louder now, filling the space like a living thing. I stumbled back toward the entrance, my chest tight with panic. The shadows seemed to shift around me, moving in ways that defied logic, their edges blurring and stretching as if reaching for me. My foot caught on a loose rock, and I fell hard, the flashlight skittering out of my hand and spinning wildly across the ground. For a moment, everything was still. I lay there, the cold seeping into my bones, staring up at the darkness above me. And then the whispering began. It was faint at first, barely audible beneath the hum. But as I lay there, frozen, it grew louder, more distinct. The words were fragmented, overlapping, spoken in a language I didn't recognize, but somehow understood. They weren't just sound. They were alive, pressing into my mind and twisting around my thoughts like vines. I scrambled to my feet, my hands trembling as I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it toward the entrance. The beam cut through the shadows, revealing the path back to the surface. I ran, the whispering growing louder with each step, until it wasn't just in my head anymore. It was all around me, filling the air like a chorus of voices, pleading and commanding at the same time. The light of the fading sun hit my face as I burst out of the cave, gasping for breath. The sheriff stood at the edge of the rubble, his back to me, staring into the trees. I called out to him, my voice raw, but he didn't turn. He didn't move. As I approached, the whispering stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so profound it felt like the world itself had paused. The sheriff turned slowly, his face pale and drawn, his eyes hollow. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Only a faint, wet gasp as a dark, viscous liquid trickled from his lips. Behind him, deep in the forest, something moved. Something massive, its form obscured by the shadows, but undeniably there. The hum returned, louder this time, resonating through the ground as the sheriff collapsed to his knees. I ran. I didn't look back, but the whispering followed, threading itself into the air, into my thoughts, into me. The whispers didn't stop. Even as I sprinted back to the truck, the sound clung to me, twisting around my thoughts like smoke. It wasn't just a noise. It was alive, threading through the air and seeping into my head. My breath came in ragged gasps as I reached the vehicle, fumbling with the door handle before throwing myself inside. The truck felt like a fragile sanctuary, its thin walls doing nothing to muffle the sound. I turned the key, the engine roaring to life, but for a moment I couldn't move. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white as I stared out at the forest. It seemed different now, darker somehow, as though the shadows between the trees had grown deeper, more deliberate. I backed out of the clearing, the tires crunching over loose gravel, and turned toward the town. The road twisted sharply, the dense canopy overhead blotting out what little light remained. The whispers ebbed and flowed, fading into the background before surging forward again, filling the truck like a second heartbeat. They weren't words exactly, but they carried a weight, a meaning that pressed against my chest with every rise and fall. The sheriff's face was burned into my mind, his hollow eyes, and the dark liquid spilling from his mouth. I couldn't stop seeing it, couldn't shake the image of the thing in the woods, its massive form shifting just beyond the edge of the light. Whatever I'd stumbled into, it wasn't natural. It wasn't something I could rationalize or explain. The town came into view suddenly, its dim streetlights flickering against the encroaching darkness. Bramblewood looked even smaller now, the handful of buildings clustered together like they were huddling against the forest. I parked outside the inn, the old structure, creaking faintly in the wind. The whispers seemed to fade as I stepped inside, replaced by a heavy silence that was almost worse. The innkeeper, a wiry woman with sharp features, glanced up from behind the counter. Her eyes lingered on me a moment too long. Her expression unreadable. "Road day?" she asked, her voice flat. I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. What was I supposed to say? That I'd seen something impossible, that the sheriff was gone, that the forest itself felt alive. Instead, I nodded, mumbling something about needing rest before retreating to my room. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and I leaned against it, my chest heaving. The room was small, the walls lined with faded wallpaper that curled at the edges. A single window looked out onto the street below, the glass fogged from the cold night air. I crossed to it, peering out at the darkened buildings and the forest beyond. The whispers were gone, but the silence wasn't comforting. It was heavy, pressing against my ears like cotton, making my own breathing sound too loud. I turned away from the window, rubbing my hands over my face, as the events of the day settled into my bones. That's when I noticed the mark. It was faint at first, just a pale outline on the palm of my hand. A spiral, its edges uneven and jagged, almost as though it had been burned into my skin. My stomach churned as I traced the lines with my fingers, the flesh tender and cold to the touch. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. The whispers returned, faint and distant, threading through the silence like a thread being pulled tight. I staggered back, my pulse pounding as the mark began to glow faintly, the light casting eerie shadows across the walls. My breath hitched, the air in the room growing colder, heavier. The light flickered, and for a moment the room felt smaller, the walls pressing closer, the shadows twisted, elongating unnaturally, and I could feel it. Something watching, something waiting just beyond the edges of my vision. I turned toward the window instinctively, but the glass was empty, reflecting only the dim interior of the room. A sudden knock at the door shattered the stillness, and I jumped, the sound too loud in the suffocating quiet. My heart raced as I crossed the room, my hand hovering over the handle. The knock came again, slower this time, deliberate. I opened the door cautiously, expecting the innkeeper, or perhaps one of the townsfolk, but the hallway was empty, the dim light flickering faintly overhead. I stepped into the corridor, glancing in both directions, but there was no one there. As I turned back toward my room, my eyes caught something on the floor. A single piece of paper, yellowed and worn, lay just beyond the threshold. I picked it up carefully, the edges brittle beneath my fingers. The writing was jagged, scrawled in a frantic hand. But it's awake. Don't look into the trees. No. The words sent a chill through me, the weight of them sinking into my chest like stones. I crumpled the paper in my fist, the mark on my hand throbbing faintly as the whispers grew louder again, threading through the silence like a haunting melody. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The whispers became part of the air, threading through every breath I took. Even when they weren't audible, I could feel them, like the sensation of a phantom limb pressing against my thoughts. The mark on my hand throbbed faintly, the glow so subtle it barely registered in the dim light of the inn room. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the crumpled note I'd found at my door, my mind racing. It's awake. Don't look into the trees. The words gnawed at me. They didn't feel like a warning. They felt like a sentence. The hours dragged on, each one slower than the last. I couldn't bring myself to lie down, couldn't even entertain the idea of closing my eyes. Every creak of the old floorboards, every gust of wind against the window set my nerves on edge. The forest outside the inn was more than just a backdrop. And it was alive, watching, waiting. Sometime after midnight, the whispers changed. They grew louder, closer, forming words that I couldn't quite understand. My heart pounded as I crossed to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peer outside. The street was empty, bathed in the faint glow of a flickering lamppost. The forest loomed beyond it, the tree line dense and impenetrable. At first I didn't see anything unusual, but as my eyes adjusted, I noticed the shadows. They didn't move with the wind, didn't shift with the faint sway of the branches. And they were too deliberate, too still. And then one of them moved. It was subtle, a flicker of motion at the edge of my vision. My breath hitched as I scanned the trees, my gaze darting from shadow to shadow. They were watching me. I couldn't see their faces, if they had faces, but I felt their gaze, cold and unrelenting. The whispers surged, louder now, clearer. They weren't just sounds anymore. Sounds anymore. They were words, fractured and layered, spoken by dozens of voices at once. Come to us. Healing? Nah, come to us. You don't belong here. It's already too late. My hand moved to the mark on my palm, the cold radiating from it, like a frostbite spreading under my skin. The glow grew stronger, faint tendrils of light threading through the room, casting eerie shadows on the walls. My pulse thundered as the whispers reached a crescendo, the voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony that filled the air. And then, just as suddenly, they stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing against my ears like a physical force. I staggered back from the window, my legs weak and trembling. The mark on my hand pulsed once, twice, and then dimmed. I turned back toward the room, my breath catching as I noticed something on the bed. A single twig rested on the crumpled sheets, its surface blackened and twisted. It hadn't been there before. The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, slow and deliberate. My stomach twisted as I stepped toward the door, every instinct screaming at me to stay put. But something, curiosity, fear, or perhaps the pull of the mark, drew me forward. My fingers curled around the doorknob, the metal cold against my skin, and I opened the door just enough to peer outside. The hallway was empty. The flickering light overhead cast long shadows against the worn carpet, and the faint smell of damp earth lingered in the air. But as I stepped into the corridor, I noticed something. The sound of footsteps hadn't stopped. They were behind me now. Evil Shike Ort Saul. I spun around, my heart hammering as I pressed my back against the wall. The whispers returned, softer this time, teasing the edge of my hearing. The shadows at the far end of the hallway shifted, their edges blurring as though they were dissolving into the air. I blinked, and they were gone. I didn't remember moving, but somehow I found myself at the inn's front door. The night air hit me like a wall, cold and biting. As I stepped outside, the street was as empty as before, the lamppost casting long, jagged shadows that stretched toward the forest. My feet moved on their own, carrying me closer to the tree line, despite every rational part of my mind begging me to turn back. The forest was darker than it should have been. The canopy above blocked out even the faintest sliver of moonlight, and the air grew heavier with every step I took. The mark on my hand burned brighter now, illuminating the ground in front of me with an eerie, pale light. The whispers guided me, pulling me deeper into the woods. The first clearing appeared suddenly, the trees giving way to a circle of bare earth. In its center was an altar, rough and ancient, its surface carved with spirals and symbols that pulsed faintly with the same light as my mark. My knees buckled as I approached, the weight of the whispers pressing down on me like a physical force. The mark on my hand flared, and for a moment, I wasn't in the clearing anymore. My vision blurred, the world around me dissolving into darkness. Images flashed through my mind, faces I didn't recognize, contorted in fear. A town swallowed by shadow, a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching. When I came back to myself, I was kneeling before the altar, my hand pressed against its cold, rough surface. The light from my mark dimmed, and the whispers faded into silence. The forest around me felt different now, heavier, more alive. I could feel it breathing, pulsing, waiting. I turned back toward the town, but something stopped me. A sound, faint and distant, echoing through the trees. It wasn't the whispers this time. It was something else. Something closer. The sound was a low, guttural hum, vibrating through the trees and into my chest. It wasn't like the whispers. This was deeper, heavier, resonating in a way that felt alive. The forest around me seemed to respond, the branches creaking softly as though they were leaning closer to listen. My breath hitched, and the mark on my hand flared faintly, its cold light casting eerie shadows across the clearing. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. The hum grew louder, more deliberate, the vibrations sinking into the earth beneath my knees. My gaze darted to the altar, its carvings glowing faintly, pulsing in time with the sound. Whatever this was, it was coming from the ground. No, from beneath it. The hum shifted, breaking into a series of soft, rhythmic thuds, like distant footsteps echoing through the earth. My stomach twisted as the realization hit me. Something was moving down there. Something massive. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me as I backed away from the altar. The forest felt tighter now, the trees pressing in, their shadows stretching unnaturally across the clearing. My breathing was shallow, each inhale feeling like it carried the weight of the air itself. The thudding grew louder, faster, filling my head with a pressure that made my vision blur. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It pressed against my ears, suffocating and absolute, the kind of quiet that left no room for anything else. I staggered backward, the light from the mark on my hand flickering like a dying flame. The whispers hadn't returned, but I could feel them, lingering at the edges of my consciousness, waiting for the right moment to creep back in. My foot caught on a root, and I stumbled, catching myself against a tree. The bark was rough and cold, its surface strangely damp beneath my fingers. I pulled my hand back instinctively, glancing down to see it smeared with a dark, sticky substance. The faint metallic scent hit me a second later, and my stomach turned. It wasn't sap. It was blood. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest, and I staggered back, wiping my hand on my jacket. The hum began again, softer this time, but it felt closer, as though it were rising toward the surface. My eyes darted toward the ground, searching for any sign of movement. The earth beneath the altar trembled faintly, cracks spidering out from its base. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. My feet moved on their own, carrying me out of the clearing and back into the dense woods. The forest felt alive around me. Every creak of the branches and rustle of the leaves, like a breath on the back of my neck. I didn't dare look back. Whatever was coming, I didn't want to see it. The path back to town should have been straightforward, but the forest had other plans. The trees seemed to shift as I moved, the trail twisting and doubling back on itself, until I wasn't sure if I was going the right way. The mark on my hand throbbed with each step, its glow flickering faintly in the darkness. I stopped to catch my breath, leaning against a tree, as the whispers returned, faint and fragmented. They weren't voices this time. They were sounds, footsteps crunching through the underbrush, the snap of twigs, the faint rustle of something moving just beyond the edge of my vision. I turned sharply, the flashlight in my hand casting a shaky beam through the trees. The light caught on something pale, a flash of movement that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. My chest tightened, my grip on the flashlight tightening as I scanned the forest. A shadow moved between the trees, its shape tall and impossibly thin. My heart raced as I stepped back, the light trembling in my hands. The shadow stopped, its head tilting slightly, as though it were listening. It didn't move closer, but it didn't retreat either. It just stood there, watching. The whispers grew louder, sharper, like nails scraping against glass. The mark on my hand burned cold, the pain shooting up my arm and into my chest. I clutched at it, my breath catching in my throat, as the shadow began to move again, gliding silently through the trees. I turned and ran, the flashlight swinging wildly in my hand as I stumbled through the underbrush. The forest seemed endless, the trees stretching impossibly tall, their branches tangling overhead to block out the sky. The shadows followed, their movements impossibly fluid, always just out of reach of the light. My lungs burned, each breath ragged as I pushed myself forward. The whispers were everywhere now, weaving through the air like a net, pulling at the edges of my mind. The mark on my hand pulsed brighter, its light casting jagged patterns on the ground as I ran. And then, suddenly, I was back. The forest opened up, the buildings of the town rising like a mirage out of the darkness. And Yule, Silgari, the lampposts flickered faintly, their weak glow casting long shadows across the empty streets. I stumbled onto the pavement, my legs giving out as I collapsed against the side of my truck. The whispers stopped. The silence was immediate, oppressive, and for a moment, I thought I might have imagined the entire thing. But the mark on my hand still burned, its glow faint but steady, a constant reminder of what I'd seen, of what was waiting in the forest. I climbed into the truck, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. Bent the wheel. The headlights cut through the dark, illuminating the road ahead. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart stopped. A shadow stood at the edge of the forest, its form barely distinguishable from the trees behind it. It didn't move, didn't follow. It just watched. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't done with me. The drive back to the inn felt endless. The headlights carved a narrow path through the darkness. But the forest pressed in on either side, its shadows impossibly deep and shifting in ways I couldn't explain. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, the mark on my palm burning faintly, a cold pulse that seemed to sync with the faint hum still lingering in my chest. The road was empty, the air outside unnaturally still. Even with the windows up, I felt the weight of the silence pressing against the thin walls of the truck. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror every few seconds, expecting to see the shadow from the forest standing in the road. But it wasn't there. That should have brought relief. But it didn't. When the inn finally came into view, its old wooden facade, barely illuminated by a single flickering porch light, my breath caught in my throat. I pulled into the lot and killed the engine, sitting in the sudden quiet as the weight of the night sank in. The whispers were gone now, replaced by an oppressive silence that felt almost worse. I stepped out of the truck, my boots crunching softly on the gravel. The air was colder here, sharper, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and something metallic. The mark on my hand tingled faintly as I approached the door, its glow barely visible beneath the dim light of the inn's porch. The innkeeper was gone. The desk sat empty, the small lamp beside it casting long shadows across the walls. I called out softly, my voice barely carrying in the suffocating quiet. No answer, just the faint creak of the floorboards under my weight as I made my way up the stairs. The hallway stretched before me, the door to my room standing slightly ajar. I froze, my pulse quickening as I stared at the dark gap between the door and the frame. I knew I hadn't left it open. Worry, till shivers, that each. The mark on my hand flared faintly, the cold light casting faint patterns across the worn carpet. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tightly over the single window. But something was wrong. The air inside felt heavy, charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. The flashlight in my hand wavered as I scanned the room, the beam catching on something that made my stomach twist. The bed was covered in twigs, not scattered randomly, but arranged in a deliberate pattern, spirals overlapping and intertwining like veins. The faint smell of pine and decay filled the room, and my chest tightened as I stepped closer. In the center of the bed, nestled among the twigs, was another note. I reached for it hesitantly, my fingers trembling as I unfolded the brittle paper. The writing was jagged, scrawled in a hand that seemed both frantic and deliberate. You can't stop it. The forest takes what it's owed. The mark on my hand burned sharply, and I dropped the note, clutching my palm as the light from the spiral intensified. The air in the room shifted, growing colder, heavier. The shadows on the walls seemed to move, twisting and writhing like they were alive. And then the whispers returned. They were louder this time, more distinct, their fragmented words slicing through the air like broken glass. The light from the mark pulsed in time with the whispers, casting jagged beams across the room. I stumbled back, my breath coming in shallow gasps as the shadows began to coalesce, forming shapes that defied logic. The first figure emerged from the corner, its tall, gaunt form barely visible in the dim light. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a void, a blank expanse that seemed to ripple faintly, like water disturbed by a breeze. It moved toward me without walking, its form gliding across the floor in a way that made my stomach churn. I turned and ran, the door slamming shut behind me as I stumbled into the hallway. The whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent, as I raced down the stairs and out into the night. The cold air hit me like a wall, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare look back. The town was silent, the streets empty, the faint glow of the lampposts casting long jagged shadows across the pavement. My legs carried me toward the forest, an instinct I didn't fully understand, pulling me back to where it had all begun. The whispers seemed to guide me, threading through the air like a siren's call. The clearing appeared suddenly, the altar at its center glowing faintly in the darkness. The symbols carved into its surface pulsed with a cold light, the same light that now radiated from the mark on my hand. The hum returned, deeper and louder than before, vibrating through the ground and into my chest. I approached the altar slowly, my steps hesitant, the weight of the night pressing against me. The air was thick here, suffocating, as though the forest itself was alive and watching. The earth beneath the altar trembled faintly, the cracks spreading wider, deeper, as though something beneath the surface was trying to break free. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a voice, low, resonant, and impossibly loud. The debt must be paid. The ground beneath my feet shook violently, and the cracks widened, the altar splitting down the middle as a deep, inhuman growl echoed from below. My chest tightened, the mark on my hand burning brighter than ever as the forest around me seemed to close in. The shadows emerged from the trees, their forms tall and indistinct, their movements fluid and unnatural. They surrounded the clearing, their faceless heads all turning toward me in unison. Samardino Kata. The voice spoke again, louder this time, filling the air with its presence. Shoes. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap, vibrating through my chest and sinking into my bones. Choose, bought. It wasn't a request. It was a demand, ancient and immovable. The shadows surrounding the clearing stood perfectly still, their forms flickering at the edges, like static trying to hold itself together. Their faces, or lack of faces, turned toward me, expectant. The mark on my hand burned brighter, the cold light cutting through the thick darkness and casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. I staggered back, my heart pounding as the ground beneath the altar cracked and shifted. A faint, sickly light seeped through the fissures, pulsing in time with the low hum that filled the clearing. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs refused to move. The weight of the entity's command rooted me in place, my chest heaving as the air grew colder, heavier. The altar groaned, its surface splitting further, and from within came the sound of movement. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly large. The shadows parted as something began to rise from the earth. At first, it was only a shape, an indistinct mass of darkness that seemed to consume the faint light around it. But as it emerged fully, its form became horrifyingly clear. It was massive, its body a shifting amalgamation of twisted limbs and writhing tendrils, its surface glistening like wet stone. Its face, if it could be called that, was a void, an endless abyss that pulled at my vision and made my stomach twist. The entity, the hollowing, was awake. Its presence was suffocating, a tidal wave of dread that pressed against every part of me. The shadows surrounding the clearing knelt, their forms bowing in unison, as though in reverence. The hum grew louder, deeper, resonating through the ground and into my chest. "You bear the mark," the voice said, filling the air with its weight. "You opened a way." The mark on my hand flared painfully, the light spilling out and spreading up my arm like veins of frost. I fell to my knees, clutching my hand as the cold sank into my chest, wrapping around my heart like a vice. The hollowing tilted its massive form, its abyssal face lowering toward me. "The balance is broken," it said, its voice echoing from everywhere and nowhere. "The forest hungers." I gasped for breath, the cold from the mark making my limbs feel sluggish and heavy. "I didn't open anything," I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. "You came," the hollowing said, each word a blade cutting through the air. "And now you must pay." The shadows moved closer, their forms rippling like smoke. They didn't touch me, but their presence was enough to make my skin crawl. The altar pulsed with light, the cracks in its surface widening as the ground beneath it shifted and groaned. The forest itself seemed to lean in, the trees bowing toward the hollowing as though drawn by its gravity. My mind raced, every instinct screaming at me to run, to fight, to do something. but the entity's command was absolute, its power holding me in place. As it loomed over me, "Choose," it said again, the word reverberating through the clearing. "The forest demands a sacrifice. One to seal the door." I shook my head, tears blurring my vision as I stared up at the massive, writhing form. "I can't," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I don't." "The mark binds you," it interrupted, its voice as cold and unyielding as the mark on my hand. "You are the door. You are the balance." The ground beneath me trembled, the cracks spreading outward, and from within the altar came a sound that made my blood run cold. A deep, guttural growl, like the earth itself was alive and angry. The light from the altar flared, illuminating the clearing in a sickly greenish glow. The shadows stopped moving, their forms frozen as the hollowing's abyssal face turned toward them. Slowly, one of them stepped forward, its movements hesitant and jerky, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. It knelt before the altar, its head bowed. I didn't understand at first. Then, the whispers that followed were fragmented, overlapping, but their meaning became clear as the shadows began to move, each one stepping closer to the altar in turn. They weren't here to watch me. They were here to offer themselves. The realization hit me like a blow, and I stumbled back, my knees hitting the cold, hard ground. The hollowing's presence pressed closer, its tendrils shifting and coiling as it spoke again. "Choose," it said, the word sharper, now more urgent, "or the forest will choose for you." Envelopes, fright. The mark on my hand burned brighter, the pain spreading through my chest and up into my throat. I looked at the shadows, at the altar, at the massive form looming above it all, and my mind spun with the impossibility of the choice, my own survival against the endless hunger of the forest, the shadows against the abyss. The forest had waited long enough. "I'm to live to wund. I believe, sir, they stay." The forest leaned in, the weight of its presence suffocating. My chest felt hollow, as if the very air had been pulled from my lungs and replaced with the whispers that now surged all around me. The mark on my hand burned like ice, its light flickering and pulsing in time with the shifting shadows. The hollowing loomed above the altar, its massive form twisting and writhing, pulling the forest itself into its orbit. The ground beneath me trembled, cracks splintering outward from the altar, their edges glowing with that sickly green light. The shadows gathered closer, their forms wavering but purposeful, their faceless heads all turned toward me. The hollowing's voice returned, colder and sharper than before. "The balance must be restored. Choose." The words reverberated through the clearing, each syllable driving deeper into my skull. My hands trembled as I pushed myself to my feet, the weight of its gaze pressing down on me like a physical force. My eyes darted to the shadows, then to the altar, and finally to the mark on my hand. The spiral glowed faintly, its light casting jagged patterns across the fractured earth. The choice wasn't mine. Not really. It had already been made the moment I stepped into this forest. The moment the mark appeared on my hand. The hollowing had decided long before I arrived in Bramblewood. In Bramblewood, I was the one who had been bound, the one who had been called here. But the forest didn't care about fairness. It only cared about balance. I can't do this, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the whispers that swirled around me. I didn't ask for this. The hollowing's form shifted, its tendrils reaching outward, brushing against the edge of the altar. The shadows moved in unison, stepping closer to the cracks in the earth. They knelt again, their forms bowing low, their devotion silent but absolute. The altar flared with light, and the ground buckled beneath it, the rumble of shifting earth filling the clearing. The hollowing leaned closer, its abyssal face a void that consumed everything it touched. When it spoke, its voice was colder than death. The forest does not care. The forest takes what it is owed. The mark on my hand burned brighter, the pain lancing through my arm and into my chest. I clutched at it, my breath hitching as the whispers grew louder, filling the space between my thoughts. The hollowing loomed over me, its form casting an impossible shadow that seemed to stretch endlessly into the forest. The cracks widened, and from within came a low guttural growl, deep and resonant, vibrating through the earth and into my bones. Something beneath the altar was stirring, its presence darker and more overwhelming than anything I had felt before. The hollowing wasn't the end of this. It was the beginning. It was the beginning. The shadows moved again, their forms circling the altar in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Their movements were wrong, jerky, inhuman, but there was no hesitation in their purpose. One by one, they stepped into the cracks, their forms dissolving into the light as they were swallowed by the earth. The ground drank them in, their silent offerings accepted without ceremony. The hollowing's gaze turned back to me, the void of its face seeming to expand, pulling at my thoughts, my will, my very existence. One more, it said, its voice a command that brooked no argument. The door must close. The air around me grew heavier, the cold sinking into my skin and freezing me from the inside out. I staggered back, my mind racing as the reality of the choice crashed over me like a tidal wave. The mark on my hand pulsed again, brighter and colder, the spiral seeming to twist and writhe on my skin. I stepped forward, my legs trembling beneath me, the weight of the hollowing's command driving me toward the altar. The light from the cracks flared brighter, illuminating the jagged symbols carved into the stone, their lines sharp and uneven, pulsing with the same rhythm as the mark on my hand. The forest was silent now, the whispers gone. There was only the hum, low and resonant, vibrating through the air as the altar seemed to pull me closer. The shadows were gone, their sacrifice already made, and now the hollowing waited for me to complete the balance. I stopped at the edge of the cracks, the light searing against my skin, the mark on my hand burning with a cold fire that spread through my veins. The hollowing loomed above me, its form shifting and writhing, the void of its face pulling at the edges of my vision. I closed my eyes, my breath trembling, as I whispered the only word I could: yes. The moment the word left my lips, the ground beneath the altar erupted with light, blinding and all-consuming. The mark on my hand flared one final time, the pain reaching a crescendo before disappearing altogether. The world around me dissolved into shadow and light, the clearing fading into nothingness as the hollowing's voice filled my mind. The door is sealed. The balance is restored. And then silence. And then silence. When I opened my eyes, the clearing was gone. The forest was still and empty, the altar reduced to a pile of shattered stone. The shadows were nowhere to be seen, and the mark on my hand had vanished, leaving only faint, pale scars in its place. But the air still felt heavy, the weight of what I had done pressing down on me with every breath. The forest was quiet, but it wasn't gone. The hollowing wasn't gone. It was a part of me now, its presence lingering at the edge of my thoughts, waiting. The balance had been restored, but I knew, deep down, that it wouldn't last.